guests on the panel today. So I just want to start by introducing them. I'm going to mostly introduce their books, and what I'd like you to know, other than what I say about them, there are full bios in your program and on the website. The exception to that is Senator Hinsdale sent a very humble bio. It's very humble. So I'm going to say a little more about it. Okay. So Nikhil Goyal is a sociologist who served as senior policy advisor on education and children for Senator Bernie Sanders. His newly released book is Live to See the Day, Coming of Age in American Poverty. A portrait of 3 children struggling to survive in Kensington, Philadelphia, which is distinguished only by its poverty. It is home to Ryan, Giancarlos, and Emmanuel, 3 Puerto Rican children who live among the most marginalized families in the United States. It's the story of their coming of age, which is beset by violence, the violence of homelessness, hunger, incarceration, stray bullets, sexual and physical assault, and the hyper-masculine logic of the streets, as well as the drug trade. Senator Kesha Hinsdale is the first woman of color to serve in the Vermont State Senate and is chair of the Senate Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs Committee. She also sits on the Senate Finance Committee and the Joint Justice Oversight Committee. She served in the Vermont House of Representatives on behalf of a Burlington district from 2008 to 16. She earned her Master of Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government in 2018. When not in the legislature, Kesha teaches structural inequality, environmental justice at Vermont Law and Graduate School. She has also served as co-chair of the Vermont Attorney General's Immigration Task Force and is a member of the boards of Emerge, Vermont, Planned Parenthood of Northern New England, and the Vermont Natural Resources Council, among others, and she's a founder of the Bright Leadership Institute. Brad Kessler is a critically acclaimed and award-winning novelist. He is the author of North, a 2021 novel that concerns the intertwined lives of a Vermont monk, a Somali refugee, and an Afghan war veteran. Brad and 3 authors, Shadir Mohammed, Fardousa M. Abdi Hamid Mohammed, are also now releasing an anthology, Deep North, Stories of Somali Resettlement in Vermont, which Brad collected, edited, and wrote an afterword for. Deep North tells the stories of the author's experiences of coming to America from war-torn Somalia. And Felicia Kornbluh, at the middle of the table, is professor of history at the University of Vermont with a secondary appointment in gender, sexuality, and women's studies, and is an affiliated faculty member in Jewish studies. Her book, A Woman's Life is a Human Life, My Mother, Our Neighbor, and the Journey from Reproductive Rights to Reproductive Justice, is the story of everyday activists who defined those rights and achieved them in the years immediately before and after Roe v. Wade made abortion legal under federal law. The book concerns 2 movements in New York that transformed the politics of reproductive rights: the fight to decriminalize abortion and the fight against sterilization abuse, which happened disproportionately in communities of color. Dr. Kornbluh's mother wrote the first draft of New York's law decriminalizing abortion, and their across-the-hall neighbor, Dr. Helen Rodriguez Trias, a Puerto Rican doctor, co-founded the movement against sterilization abuse. And it's very interesting that these 2 women did not interact a lot, and that's part of the frame of the book. The books I've just mentioned have some things in common, but each is an entire world unto itself, and in order to bring their authors together in conversation, I came up with the frame of the American dream, because it speaks to an ideal I'm not sure has ever been achieved, but it is still held up as our legacy. As it says in the panel description, the American dream generally holds that every U.S. citizen deserves an equal opportunity to succeed and prosper in our society, to reach goals and aspirations through hard work and motivation, encountering reasonably equal, if minimal, barriers. So each of the books we discussed has at its center a conversation about America. In speaking about poverty, women's rights, persons from other countries who have become refugees seeking safe harbor, we are speaking about the American dream to some extent. So that's how the panel came together. I'm addressing my guests as they've requested to be addressed. And with your permission, I'm going to shorten the titles of your books when I refer to them. I invited Senator Hinsdale here because she works in the legislature, and I thought it would be completely amiss if we did not have somebody representing that interest on this panel. Okay? One more thing I'm going to say about these books is that while all of these are nonfiction, each one has a significant narrative content, storytelling content. Dr. Kornbluh's book about her mother and their neighbor uses narrative toward a larger commentary about the history of reproductive justice. Nikhil Goyal uses narrative as well as statistics and history, but his book is largely narrative about these three young men, and yet his ideas come through beautifully. And the anthology that Brad Kessler edited is almost entirely narrative. The stories and the storytellers speak for themselves. I found them all incredibly accessible, very illuminating, and so I just wanted to say that. I also want to say, please turn off your cell phones. I should have said this to begin with. Please turn off your cell phones. And before I go any further, I'm going to thank our sponsors, who are so important. Burlington City Arts, Fletcher Free Library, Hanson and Doremus, Media Factory, who's recording in the back of the room right now, Northfield Savings Bank, Phoenix Books, Pomerleau Real Estate, UVM Humanities Center, Vermont Arts Council, Vermont Humanities. Okay. Later today, after their events, these authors will be in the main reading room to meet you and sign their books if you would like to meet them. Okay. Should have started with that, sorry. I want to start by talking about humanity. I feel like we are at our best as a community, as a nation, when we pull together. So a few things about your books. In A Woman's Life is a Human Life, Felicia, you write about your mother's lack of relationship with her neighbor, which I just touched on for a second there. Mm-hmm. Dr. Rodriguez-Trias, who, like her, worked toward reproductive justice. Okay. In Brad's book, there's a character, a storyteller named Fardusa, who experienced great jealousy from her neighbors as her life began to go well. Right? And then in Live to See the Day, some teachers and caseworkers are at times unsupportive and even mocking or belittling of their students. And there are more examples throughout our lives everywhere, of course, but these boil down to a lack of empathy through not fully understanding what another human being is going through. So I want to ask all of you to talk a little bit about the ways in which division undercuts progress, even when nominally people share values.
Let me start, and thank you so much for the introduction and the opportunity. Thanks everyone for being here. And I'll just say also about my colleague over here, Senator Kesha Hinsdale. She and I served together on the board of Planned Parenthood of Northern New England, and some of the work that we were doing or attempting to do as board members, bringing the perspective of reproductive justice and a critically engaged approach to the reproductive rights movement on that board. Some of that is very much what informed the research and the writing for this book. So thank you for being my colleague in that effort. And anybody who's interested in Planned Parenthood as an organization and in this movement today, I think we can have a very interesting conversation about both the successes and the limitations of the current movement, without taking anything away from how vital and necessary that work is right now. I think a lack of empathy is one way to think about it. I also think that we really are shaped by our experiences, and unless, so my mom was a Jewish woman raised in a working class family. She became an attorney. She was raised by a single mom who was herself an immigrant from what today is Belarus. My mom got herself into law school without having finished her BA. She had 2 years of college before she went to law school, and kind of fought her way into the legal profession as a working class Jewish woman of her generation. And she became an early member of the National Organization for Women, which was in the early to middle 1960s a crusading and really unique organization fighting for women's civil rights, and very much modeled on the work that the NAACP was doing and had done for black civil rights, right? With Brown versus Board and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and so on. So my mother was very much affiliated with that movement, and the fight to decriminalize abortion, that is to undo the criminal abortion laws that had been put into place in the 19th century in states like New York and Vermont, that fight was very much informed by the fight for women's equality, this civil rights fight emerging in the 60s. And what my mom didn't understand was that the fight for reproductive control or reproductive freedom, or what today many activists and scholars call reproductive justice, that fight could encompass not only the fight for abortion access and birth control access, but also could encompass the fight, for example, against imperialism in Puerto Rico, because what Puerto Rican women activists like our neighbor came to understand was that as part of U.S. control on the island of Puerto Rico, there also was a public policy, drift or pressure, coercion towards sterilization as a primary means of birth control. So people there were not only fighting against abortion laws that made it a crime to seek to control your reproduction, but they also were fighting against public policies that pushed them toward never having kids, right, and not having the opportunity to have kids, even if they were in their 20s or early 30s, right, that there was a public policy that created a situation where by the late 1960s, 35% of Puerto Rican women of reproductive age had been sterilized, had had sterilization procedures, right, and so my mom, because of her background, she thought this is a fight about women's equality, women's civil rights, and that leads me toward the fight for birth control and for legal abortion. And for our neighbor, Helen Rodriguez Trias, coming from Puerto Rico, fighting against imperialism there, she had become an anti-imperialist on the island of Puerto Rico, and then fighting in behalf of Puerto Rican and black and poor white people on the U.S. mainland, right? She had an experience and a political perspective that was that much broader, right? That encompassed the fight against imperialism, the fight against racism, the fight against the way people who were using Medicaid as their form of health insurance, how all of those people were being pushed sometimes coercively and sometimes even without their knowledge into sterilization procedures. And for my mom, she didn't get it, that was part of the fight. Yeah.
Mean to indicate that your mom had a lack of empathy.
Yeah.
Using that as sort of more general for these situations, but it is true that had they found each other and common cause, they probably would have been able to fight each of their causes more effectively.
Yeah, they might have been.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, that I'm not letting my mother off the hook. I'll just say that, right? I'm really not. I think the fight for legal abortion is a critical fight, and I think that it's important for us to understand that that's also in this wider context. Yeah,
great. Let's see. I think Brad, do you want to speak to the jealousy that Fardusa experienced, or whatever comes to mind?
Yeah. Well, I'll just give a little background to say that I started writing this novel. This came out in 2021, as Shayla mentioned. And in the course of doing the research for this book, I met these remarkable people here in Winooski and Burlington, and they were Somalis who had been resettled here, and I met Laurie Stavron, who's in the audience, from the U.S. Committee of Refugees and Immigrants, and because their stories were so incredible, we kind of developed this idea that here I was, the white guy writing a novel partly about immigrant experience or a person seeking asylum in the States. And right here in your hometown were these people who had lived this, life, this fictional story that I wrote. And their stories were so compelling and so much more interesting in a way than the fictional version that I believed it would be great, and we all believed collectively that it would be great to have their voices, their stories told and narrated. So we began about 5 years ago to it was right before COVID to do these kind of deep dives into everyone's story. And these were often people, we concentrated on 3 different members of the Somali community, which is pretty diverse. So it was Somali Bantu, ethnic Somali who grew up in the city, and a camel herder who was also Somali. So a very diverse group that, people of your local people that came here. There was hours of, I think, 5 years worth of Zoom and hours of taping and stuff, and that condensed into these 3 stories. And what was amazing is that these stories that the people who had lived through these stories, particularly Fardosa, her son was acting as the translator, and he had an adult son who was 27 at the time, or 26. He had never heard these stories that his mother, he didn't know his mother's story because his mother was doing everything she could to just get us into a safe place. And that was kind of the theme over and over, that these people who had come here didn't have the luxury or the time to reflect and to talk about what they had been through. And so this project was, in my mind, incredible intertwining of storytelling, narrative, and sort of healing, intergenerational almost, as the younger people are now hearing the stories of their parents, and the younger people now are, going to Hofstra or going to college, and so they don't want to hear this, or they don't, I think they're at the stage now where they will want to hear, because they're out of their teens and into their 20s. So that's a long way of saying somewhere there's empathy in there. I don't know where, but I could go on about empathy, but I'd rather hear from you guys.
Great, Nikhil.
Sure. And you can hear me all right, just be back here.
So the small mic is for the television, and the
Sure.
larger mic is for the room. Can the room hear us well?
Oh, good? Okay.
Okay. I'm having trouble.
Okay.
I don't know if you need to sit closer.
Maybe I'll just sit a little closer. Yeah, no worries.
Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here, and thanks to you for organizing this wonderful panel, and all the folks here at the festival for putting this together. I'm really glad to be here. So I can perhaps start by answering that question by talking a little bit about the beginning of the book, which starts with a story of a young person named Ryan Rivera, who grew up in Philadelphia, was in middle school, and one day he engaged in some mischief with a group of his classmates and decided to start a trash can fire in a school hallway. That fire over time was quickly extinguished by a staff member, but that child was eventually brought to an interrogation room where there was 2 school resource officers, also known as police officers assigned to school buildings. And he was then interrogated by those officers as well as administrators. Neither of his parents were present. And then he was eventually arrested and sent to juvenile detention and funneled through the juvenile justice system for the crime of starting this fire. And this was a young person who grew up in deep poverty, was raised by a single mother, endured multiple evictions and enormous housing instability throughout his life. His father had been incarcerated and passed away when he was 5 years old. This was a young person who was denied the basic building blocks of dignified life. And instead of that child being given counseling or care or a form of restorative justice, that child was criminalized and treated as a pariah by administrators and the school community. He was eventually expelled from Grover Washington as middle school and sent to a for-profit disciplinary school called Community Education Partners. And Community Education Partners started in 1996. It was founded by a group of men with ties to the Republican Party. And their pitch to school districts were, you have a group of students who are disruptive, who are behaviorally challenged, and you don't want to deal with them, and so give them to us. And we will warehouse them and keep them in a place where their behavior is not going to influence your educational performance in terms of grades or test scores. And so they eventually got contracts in Dallas and Houston, and that model was exported to Philadelphia in the early 2000s. And so, one point just to note, the one of the early investors to CEP was a man named Thomas Beasley, who founded the world's largest and first private prison enterprise. So the tentacles of the juvenile justice system for the coercion of profit and the private sector all seeped within the larger context of public education. And so this young person had to go through a metal detector, stopped and frisked by a resource officer, literally had to walk with his hands behind his back into what they call communities, where they stayed for the rest of the school day. There was very little formal instruction, lots of fighting and violence. It was fundamentally a place where you would warehouse children who were seen as subhuman. And so I traced Ryan's life at this school. He eventually comes back to the traditional school system. And his experience both there as well as his time at a school called El Centro de Estudiantes, an alternative last chance high school that works with kids who had dropped out, or I would say pushed out of school. And there he received a radically different form of education: small classes, restorative justice, access to resiliency specialists and trauma-informed care, where children were respected, their voices mattered, and they were treated with enormous respect and dignity. And so to the question around lack of empathy, here you had two vastly different educational experiences within one Philadelphia school district. And I think it's a testament to show, where children are treated humanely by adults, and one where children are criminalized and put into a jail-like educational setting. So, I think those two experiences sort of the dichotomy within American public education.
Thank you very much. Kesha, I was wondering if you could speak to working from within the system to try to make change. I know that's a very big question, but maybe something that was said here could spark something for you.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here with esteemed authors and lovers of books. I am Hindu and Jewish, and I think both are, great lovers of text and the written word. If I threw a book as a child, which probably happened just once or twice, that was probably the most mad I ever saw my father, who was a Hindu whose family fled the part of India that became Pakistan. My mother, now what would be considered Ukrainian Jews. So, migration and forced narrative thread in my story as well. And I am earning my keep here. I am working on a book. I have a contract with Island Press. And so much of what was said and the themes we're touching on are part of the premise of this book. I have a co-author, and we're essentially trying to help catalog the stories of women, people of color, marginalized folks who have been erased from the environmental movement. And so, narrative is so much at the center of whose humanity is seen, whose contributions are valued. For me, a really important way to start that exploration in the book is to think about the juxtaposition of Henry David Thoreau and Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was 3 years younger than Henry David Thoreau. They were peers in history. No offense to writers, Henry David Thoreau basically house sat for Ralph Waldo Emerson and went 4 miles from home and wrote about the environment. And Harriet Tubman used the stars and the rivers and to travel the entire eastern seaboard to bring people to freedom. Who gets credit as an environmentalist in that context? So, for me, it's all about how our humanity is erased when our stories aren't told. And that absolutely shows up everywhere in the policy world. When you think about any of the policies we're talking about, and I teach this in my structural inequality class at the law school, you have to go back to whose humanity is valued and whose isn't in this system, who's seen as expendable or easy to manipulate in the healthcare system, who's seen as unworthy of having children, who's seen as worthy of a second chance or not. That informs everything we do. So when people ask me in the flood recovery, why are farmers getting their money, like no questions asked, what's your wire transfer? Why are businesses getting, instant money? I'm supportive of, Chair Economic Development, supportive of farmers and businesses getting money right away, but you have low-income people and homeowners and farm workers who are getting absolutely nothing and, struggling to be seen in their basic humanity to get any financial support in this recovery. So it shows up in literally everything we do. Many people know that I've been, visible in the press lately around housing, which to me is the fundamental question of what the American dream is and who has access to possession of land, 9/10 of the law, and who has the ability to grow wealth in this country. The enormous wealth gap in this country is predicated on who has been able to purchase housing or not and be a homeowner. And so when I think about the work of authors and the books, we rely on them to help tell stories that we don't have time to in the policy world. So when I was passing the Home Act, I had a copy of The Color of Law facing the witness. And I said to mostly planners, if you haven't read this book, I ask you to go read it and then come back and testify to my committee. Because I can't catalog all of the ways in which the local, state, and federal government have denied Black people and people of color access to that basic American dream, but they can tell that story, and then I can ask those witnesses, what are we going to do about it?
Wonderful, thank you. That's a really great segue into my next question, which is why I popped up. I want to talk about race. All three of these books concern race in part or overtly. This is a quote from a woman's life that really struck me. Critics argued that now's mostly white, middle-class members didn't understand the ways race and class fractured women's experiences, so they could never do what they claimed, which was to represent the interests and needs of all women. So that's one. It's possible we're just going to get to two questions because this is very interesting and there's lots to talk about. And this is from Live to See the Day. This is Heather, a staffer working for the district's Office of Attendance and Truancy. She said, you have Black and brown people standing in front of white males. This is so Jim Crow, Northeast racism. It's an undercurrent. You have these people explain themselves to someone who doesn't understand you, your culture, and what you're up against. Until we have fair schools and fair housing and fair wages and fair health care, you can't incriminate families for doing the best that they can. In Deep North, this is a little lighter, but Shadir recounts the story of arriving at JFK with his family. The children were amazed at New York. They had never seen so many white people before. It is, it is just the difference stands out and it affects how people treat each other. So I wonder if we can talk about race. I wonder if you would say, page turn, that race is the biggest impediment in this country to pulling together and fixing things. I will start the way I asked the question with Felicia, please.
Well, it's a big old impediment, that's for sure. In my story, so I do talk about the National Organization for Women now, which was and is an incredibly important organization, just as is Planned Parenthood or NARAL, which I understand just in the past week or so is no longer going to be NARAL. It's now an organization committed to reproductive freedom, which is more along the lines of, I think, the message of my book. The problem is that, and as we've learned as activists and as scholars, is that there is no one experience called a women's experience, right? And there is no one experience of reproductive rights or even the denial of reproductive rights, right? And I think in the last 50 years since Roe versus Wade, or 60 or 70 years since these movements started, we've gotten a lot smarter and more sophisticated about how we think about that. And we understand that, different people who identify as women or identify as female actually have very different experiences based on their racial background and based on the history of racism that they may have experienced. And also based on their immigration status or whether they're native born and whether their first language is English or not, and based on their economic class. So I would say race probably number one in our society because of our American history and all those other things too. And we've gotten better, and I think we can get better yet at understanding how, how an experience that we might think of as, a denial of women's rights, which it is, is also constantly and always persistently inflected, right, and shaped and determined by these other aspects of our lives and our identities. And in some ways, I think that makes it harder to make big claims, like, this is a women's rights fight, which is what people said in the 70s. They thought there was one experience. Some people, like my mom, thought there was one experience of women's civil rights or of reproductive rights. But I think it also is a ground of not just empathy, but also of coalition building and of much richer and possibly more long-lasting and more effective kinds of politics, where we're actually seeing and hearing from and building with and working with one another when we understand the diversity of our experiences, the genuine diversity of our experiences, and the genuine diversity of our needs. So that's what I see in the world of reproductive rights, where, right now we are in a fight of our lives just to ensure base level abortion access around the country. And at the same time, there are people who need to be in this fight if we're going to win. And if it's just all about abortion and it doesn't say anything about people's rights as immigrants, people's rights as people of color, as working class and poor people, right? If we don't speak to that, then we're not going to build the kinds of effective, robust fighting, militant politics that we need in order to ensure our rights in this generation and going forward.
Yeah, so can you hear me now? Yes. So I think I would reframe Shayla's question about is race an impediment to the American dream? I would say it's actually the foundation. Race is the premise of the American dream, which is to say the American dream is really a land grab by white Europeans that came over and took over the most important source of wealth, which is land, displaced the people that were living here or created genocide, and imported another group of people from another country in Africa to work that land and be enslaved. So all the wealth that was ever made in this country that provided for the next generations of people who wanted to live the American dream, that wealth came from the land. I mean, I'm a farmer, so I know the importance of land. And, so whether it's lumber or gold or wool from sheep or petroleum or uranium or coal, it all comes from the land. And that's what built probably the Fletcher Library was built by some form of extraction from the land. So that provides the basis of the American dream. And so I think we've come to realize that, I think that's why you hedged with the American dream as a theme, because does it really exist? What is it now? Isn't it really an American nightmare? And so, it kind of, all of us were a little confused, I think, about where we're going with the American dream.
So sorry. Last week I was like, what was I?
Yeah. But it ties in nicely here with what the senator said about housing. I mean, it's basically the same thing as who has the land, who has the wealth, and who is let in and who's let out. And so we have this rich, very obvious history of the people who were let in and the people who got the land and the people who weren't. And it sort of goes to your book. So I'm just throwing that out there for the next someone to pick up.
So I think I would answer this by recounting, one statistic. In Kensington, which is the poorest neighborhood of the poorest large city in America, Philadelphia, babies are expected to live to the age of 71. And just 4 miles away in Society Hill, which is a predominantly white, middle-class, affluent neighborhood, babies are expected to live to the age of 88. So 17 years gap, just 4 miles away. And I think it illustrates the levels of premature death imposed upon certain members of the population. And Kensington is predominantly Puerto Rican, African American, and white working class. And so it has regardless of color and race, people are exploited in some of the most horrific ways, whether it's through housing or healthcare or education or employment. And so, but it certainly affects disproportionately those of color more so and in more tense format. And I often, people ask me, like, where did the title Live to See the Day come from? And it came out of conversations I had with Ryan and Emmanuel and Giancarlos and other Philadelphia youth. And Ryan in particular would tell me that when he was a teenager, he could not envision life after the age of 18. He didn't think he would even make it to 18. He thought either he was going to be dead or incarcerated. And then there was a conversation I had with another young person, and it was his birthday a couple of years ago, and I wished him happy birthday. And I asked him, how do you feel? And he said, I'm just glad I made it another year. And the idea that that young people don't know if they're going to make it to their next birthday or make it to adulthood is something that should not just shock us, but it should appall us as Americans and anybody who believes in basic decency and justice. Because I grew up on Long Island, and the idea that we were not going to make it to adulthood was never a prospect. It was just never something that even crossed our mind. So to talk to these young people and hear that whether it's from gun violence or from from various forms of childhood mortality to other forms of violence, how they could not foresee life in that way should shock us. And so to answer the question around race, I think it's very important to acknowledge obviously the legacy of structural racism, but also to acknowledge that many of the crises that face our country are ones that are affecting Americans of all races. Whether, when you think about, for example, an issue like the deaths of despair and how that is being targeted against individuals and people who don't necessarily have a college degree, and how we've seen mortality rates and abuse rates and substance abuse and among other metrics go up, particularly for people who don't have a college degree, regardless of color. I think, to me, it's important to craft a narrative about the need for universal programs that affect all of us, decent healthcare, housing, employment, education, but to have also what is known as targeting within universalism, so that marginalized groups and people that have been disproportionately affected are benefiting as well, to rectify the historical legacies. So I think we can do both at the same time. And when I worked at the Senate, we tried to pass a bill called Build Back Better, which would have provided a robust social democracy in the form of a cradle-to-grave agenda that would have affected white, black, Latino, Asian, Native people, and provided people with a real sense of dignity and economic security. And so I think we can do both at the same time.
Thank you. Wonderful. I'm going out of order here because a couple of comments that were just made make me think of this other question, which is, so I think part of the American dream thing has to do with when you're children being told you can be anything you want. This is America. It's the land of freedom and opportunity. And I think the American dream is something that gets put in our minds at a very young age. All of these books have to do with children, whether it be young girls getting pregnant and having no agency, and children that are being incarcerated for doing things in school that other children would never be incarcerated for. So that's another sort of socioeconomic difference thing. But and then of course, fleeing a war-torn country with your children, it is inconceivable, absolutely inconceivable, and coming to America. So what would each of you say to a child about their prospects and the American dream today? You have the opportunity, and I would invite Kesha to start.
Sure. I mean, the value and the curse of hearing everybody is it changes everything I want to say every time someone else speaks. I certainly can't help but start with my own story. Father from the part of India that became Chicago, Jews who were fur traders turned into, running the big and tall department store in Beverly Hills, met at UCLA, and then proceeded to buy and operate an Irish pub. I love talking about the American dream because it's something that still has allure and appeal and, should have value in so much as It's about not asking someone where they come from, but what they can contribute and what they can do. And a beloved community that Martin Luther King was talking about. And just the idea that, we have so few countries that have attempted what we've attempted. And so, like Felicia said, at the same time that you knock something or you criticize it, that is part of the American dream too. And that is what makes this experiment so great and so worthwhile. And yet, if you read a book like Caste by Isabel Wilkerson Ray, she will say that the Black experience in America is a harder boundary around your social mobility than being an untouchable in India. That we look at study after study, and any Black family that gains wealth is much more in jeopardy of losing it in the next generation. So, I'm so glad we're talking about how the American dream is really defined by anti-Blackness or your proximity to Blackness in many ways, or the erasure of Indigenous people. When I think about my parents operating an Irish pub, before that, my father, as a brown man in Los Angeles, would constantly be told, go back to Mexico. Pulled over by the police all the time, stolen vehicles, stolen tires, stolen license plate. So, I don't know if Nikhil experiences this, but I call it triple consciousness. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about double consciousness, that, Black Americans constantly have to think about what white people are thinking of them in order to survive and possibly thrive. And white people never have to think about the experiences of Black people or their humanity. As a brown person who watched my father, we were in the car plenty of times when he was pulled over. I was arrested at the age of 13 and asked, are you Mexican? And held most of the night in a facility. We know that what it's like to lose your humanity, but I don't think we have the same experience with what if I lose my life in this interaction as often. And so walking that line, has been this experience that for many kids, no one's ever, there's no words for that. No one's ever talking about that, except, my dad, when he shows up at the police station and screams at the law enforcement officers, how dare you? And so, it's been hard to sort of see those stories told and feel the experience of your humanity. And that's the policy work I try to do. My parents got a loan from the Women's Bank of Los Angeles to open the pub. Being a free lunch kid later in life, when my parents split up and we were experiencing poverty, I could I could take the SATs and apply to college for free. So the American dream is something you can access if policies are rebalanced. And if in my view, I teach critical race theory at the law school, and I didn't, before I knew what critical race theory was, I had this basic idea that if you design policies for a single Black mother, you will benefit. That is universal design. That will be a successful policy. But then you still have to make sure they get access to it, because Black Americans have fought so long and hard for so many rights, have saved our democracy, have shaped policy that remakes itself over and over again to achieve equity, and yet they are erased the second that, it finally comes to pass and victory is won. That's part of the book I'm writing, in the sense that right now the environmental justice movement and Justice 40, the idea that 40% of the country has received so little investment or disinvestment and are now supposed to benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act, right as that huge tranche of money is going to healthier communities and communities that have never had trees on their streets. We look at New York City right now, right when their infrastructure needs to be rebuilt, and we need to rethink resilience and flexible retreat from coastlines and waterways. They took race out of the mapping tool for what's considered an impacted environmental justice community, because of fear from Republican and conservative litigation taking away funds for Black farmers in the last tranche of money. So every time you see Black people fight for a policy that works for them, it ends up being money that goes to somebody else. And to me, that's the story of having representation and following that money and tracking it. I created the Bright Leadership Institute because Luvenia Dorsey Bright was the only woman of color to serve before me in the legislature. Black woman who served from South Burlington in the 90s who actually just passed away. But in 2009, I was the second woman of color to ever serve in the state legislature. And now in 2020, becoming the first woman of color to serve in the state Senate, Vermonters are like, yay, and everyone else is, what? What is going on? So, we're not going to change these things until different stories are told and policymakers have different experiences that they're bringing to the table.
Mm-hmm. I love what was just said, and I would underline all that. I teach critical race theory to undergraduates at the University of Vermont. Actually, I'm teaching a seminar right now that's an introduction to the history of American law, where we're talking about racial justice as a primary frame for understanding everything about our history and about our legal history in particular. Where it shows up in the reproductive rights and justice area is basically everywhere. And I'll tell one little story and then say what I would say to a young person today. In the world of reproductive rights, often people will talk sort of about the bad old days and about how before Roe versus Wade, the abortion landscape was just a landscape of, quote, butchers. And my mother used to say this all the time, before Roe versus Wade, before abortion decriminalization, it was just back alleys and it was butchers. She would say, Felicia, you don't understand. They were butchers. And she had a very strong idea about what it was like before abortion was decriminalized and the degree of risk, of imminent risk to life, that many, many people experienced. And for the people of color that I wrote about, the people who laid the groundwork for what has become the reproductive justice movement in America, they also spoke a language of quote unquote butchers. But when they talked about that, they talked in general about the healthcare, all of the healthcare that they were getting in their neighborhoods. Like that was the critique that was leveled against the main hospital in the South Bronx neighborhood in New York City, which was, if not the poorest, among the poorest neighborhoods in the entire city. And there was a publicly funded hospital there called Lincoln Hospital, which is still there in transformed form, that they just considered a center of butchery. Everything that happened there was butchery. Right, so of course illegal abortion and the arrangements that people had to make were a form of, bad medical care, substandard medical care, or quote unquote butchery. But so in their experience was basically the routine experience of healthcare, right? Going to the emergency room and having to wait forever and seeing a rat run across the emergency room and being, if you were really in trouble, being left on a gurney in the hallway somewhere because there was no doctor who could see you and the caseloads were too high and the doctors were not the most skilled or experienced. Like all of that. And when I kind of got my head around that language and I saw the critique that was coming out of these neighborhoods, I really got how differences by race and class, shape everything about our experiences of healthcare, about even of our experiences of our bodies, right? And how our bodies interact with all these public institutions. So I was really getting, in a new way, an experience of how deep these differences are, right? And for young people, I would say, it is in terms of accessing reproductive rights and justice today, it is a tough slog. And, there are a lot of options that are available to wealthier people and whiter communities that are not available. And we should not, of course, it's fantastic that Vermont is seeing people from around the country who are coming from jurisdictions where abortion access is being shut down, but we should not fool ourselves about that as being a solution or a panacea, right? Because there are so many people who can't get here, right? And we have to figure out a way to break the logjam so that people can get access to sexual and reproductive health care services in their home states and their home communities. Because, as much as we might try on a shoestring to get people to Vermont or Massachusetts or New York so that they can access legal, safe reproductive health care, that is not going to be a solution for many, many Americans, millions of Americans, right? Going to Mexico. So we have to figure that out. How do we get people services and change the policy environment where they are?
So I think what I would say to a young person is a few things. One is I think it's really important to learn about the history of this country, and not just the history that's often taught in K-12 education. Really get access to a diverse range of books and texts, and through your local library, through, if you're in higher education, through college professors, and then also to learn about sociology, because I'm biased, I'm a sociologist, but I still think that there's something very enlightening about understanding the ways in which structures and institutions operate to produce the level of insecurity and suffering that exists all over this country. It's really important to understand that the conditions that we see in neighbors and communities did not come about by accident, that they're the result of decades and centuries of policies and business practices and economic decisions, among other things, that produce the inequality and insecurity. And so I think, for a lot of young people growing up in poverty or economic insecurity, they witness in their own lives the effects of that, but they may not always be able to connect the dots and understand how this all relates to one another. In the book, I talk about a young person named Ryan Rivera, and Giancarlos Rodriguez. And Giancarlos Rodriguez was an activist in an organization called Youth Unite for Change, one of the two leading youth educational justice groups in the city. And he had seen the fact that his schools were decrepit, poor infrastructure, given unsanitary school meals. He saw criminalizing structures through zero tolerance school discipline. He saw that his teachers were unpaid and not respected. He saw that he had to often worry about getting shot on his way to school or just going to activities in his own neighborhood. He saw the conditions of that his mother had to endure, going on and off of TANF and other public assistance. And then he saw the hunger. He experienced hunger in his own life. So he saw all these conditions, but they didn't necessarily connect to one another in a more systematic way. And when he joined Youth Unite for Change, he got a political education. He understood that those systems and issues that he experienced in his own life were the result of people in power depriving him of basic dignity and rights. That you as a citizen have enormous responsibility and power to change those conditions, and you can put pressure on your elected officials and on the people in power to make the policy changes that you deserve. And so he got involved with that organization. He fought against school closures in Philadelphia and zero tolerance discipline, among other policies. And so I encourage young people, first and foremost, to read, to get involved in social movements, to get involved in the labor movement. I think organizing your workplace and supporting the labor movement is perhaps one of the most fundamentally effective ways to fight against corporate power and the increasing inequality in our society. And so that's what I would suggest.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a different question of Brad. I would like to get to a Q&A from the audience in a few minutes, so I'm going to end on a Vermont sort of note, but it's not just Vermont. But in Brad's book, I should have got to the page first. In Brad's book, I loved this. So one aspect of Deep North that I really loved was the overall bafflement by your authors when they learned that they would be traveling not to New York, not to Los Angeles, not to Miami, but to Vermont. It was so funny. This is from Fardusa. We were confused. We had never heard the name Vermont. Mohammed and Abdullah ran to the computer. They went on the internet and put in the name. The first thing that came up on the screen for Vermont was a photograph of cows. Then more cows. Later he saw a photograph of Vermont in the fall, all the colors on the trees and the mountains, and that made his heart lift a little. It looked peaceful, at least, he said, peaceful and beautiful. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad after all. And so my question is actually, when I started to read Deep North, I was concerned that I would hear some stories of these people who had been through so much coming here and then maybe encountering a lot of difficulty here. But these were stories of exceptional gratitude and appreciation for their new American homeland. And I presume that is an honest interpretation.
Well, I mean,
Please?
I think it's an honest interpretation for these three individuals, but there's plenty of people who come here from around the world and face incredible racism in Vermont. I mean, Vermont is the whitest state, I think, in the country. So we have this idea that we have Bernie Sanders, we're really liberal, and it's easy to feel that we're good about ourselves because there's a black face to confront you or a black family living next door that we have to deal with. And so, the whole idea of this Deep North concept came about in conversation about the subtle racism that happens in the North. And, we were talking about the code for that was Deep North, sort of like Deep South, that it's got different flavor, a different color here, but it exists. And I think in terms of housing, so one of the most, people come to Vermont, say a Somali family or an Afghani family, they love it here, but there's no house. They can't afford housing, so they end up going to San Diego or Texas or somewhere else. So we could say, yes, you're welcome here, but unless we provide housing for them or have jobs for them, then it's all just sort of window dressing. Maybe you want to speak to that as a. Or not,
Yeah,
I don't.
no, I mean, I don't want like the Academy Award music to play or anything, so I mean,
I would love for you to speak to that, and then maybe at 11, which is in a couple minutes, we'll go
Yes.
to audience
So,
questions. Thank you.
I'll try to be brief. I mean, first of all, I wouldn't be here unless I felt like there was welcoming and a role for me. I like to say that the Vermont dream is not how many cars you have, but how many cars you have pulled out of a ditch. Like, this is such there's a deep sense of community here. When I got here and complained about things, people were like, join a committee, be in charge of something. So that was a very incredible experience for me. And my goal in politics is for everyone to be able to have that same experience. And I like to say that it feels like Vermont is this like cozy little house in the woods with a wood stove going and like a kettle on the stove, and everyone's fall and we're all happy. And then there's just people outside looking in through the window and they can't find the door. And it's really cold outside. Yeah. So just that experience of isolation, particularly for people of color, it's really overwhelming, and we lose a lot of people to better opportunities elsewhere, but also, I just spoke at Alexander Twilight's, the 200th anniversary of his graduation from Middlebury as the first black man to graduate from college, a passing man. But, he left and came back. People tried to knock the foundation off of his stone house in Brownington, Vermont. Andrew Lloyd Harris at UVM didn't walk the stage as the first black man, a couple decades later to graduate from UVM. And that's not a story that's over. People on the Underground Railroad last stop still found Canada or something else. Women of color in the legislature have left because of harassment. I have helped black women and their families find safety in Chittenden County if they couldn't find it in Rutland County, and a chance to buy a home by fundraising and going to all the people who say, Vermont's great and it's so welcoming, and say, I need $1,000 from you because this person needs to move. And if that person can't find safety in what they need in Chittenden County, they leave the state. So we're not the whitest state in the country by accident. And just having great intentions is not going to change that. We really need to be actively anti-racist and just more curious about people's experience, because what people still face is but that doesn't happen here. That didn't really happen to you. And it takes books and also this idea of gratitude for refugees, right? Our state has 90% of its population growth in the last decade has come from the in-migration of refugees and people of color. So 90% of our population growth is people of color in the census. Because white folks are aging out. If you look at the schools, 10% of our schools are kids of color, 3% of our population over 65 are people of color. So change is happening, But they're told, like, you should be so grateful to be here. So when I was looking at pandemic experiences, and we worked really hard to reach out to different immigrant and refugee communities, it took 45 minutes to be like, I know you're very grateful for everything you have, but I need you to tell me if you're struggling with mental health or food insecurity, and then people would say, yeah, I don't feel okay and I don't know where to go. And I get turned away at the doctor, or no one speaks my language, or I get in the wrong entrance to the bus and someone yells at me, or I don't know if I can pick the fruit, and pickle it. And I'm like, I know what that's like as an Indian person, just like they have these experiences of being othered all the time, and they can't talk about it because people would just be, oh, does that really happen? And you should be so grateful. So we just really deny people their basic ability to tell their story.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great place to end. Although I'll say, I didn't mean that they should be so grateful. They just
Yes, right. It's a fine line.
In there.
Because I'm grateful, and my husband's grew up on a dairy farm, and I love Vermont.
No, I think yeah. Anyway, so let's turn it over to the audience and see what questions you have.
I don't know if it's a question. I don't like the concept of the American dream. I think it's a myth that was created to counteract the despair that people who came to America felt. And I think in Buddhism, they have a term called the wise society, which I think is such a much more beautiful concept. It's about where everyone is cared for, even the most vulnerable, and the land is cared for, and people are treated with respect. And so I just feel like we keep trying to redefine the American dream, but I think we should just throw that concept out because it's so tarnished. It's built on racism and economic injustice and social injustice and all the injustices. So I'm just not a fan of it. So I don't know if anybody has a comment towards that. Thank you.
Thanks.
I mean, every 4th of July or whichever, Thanksgiving, who knows, I try to read Langston Hughes, Let America Be America, again, the land that has never been. I still think the idea of a multicultural democracy is so potent and so powerful. It has never been, but like I obviously work within the system, and I live every day, working towards something that forms a more perfect union. But I'm like also an Obama leader and going to the Obama summit. I know people are really jaded by that perspective. And my father, lived the American dream with his Irish pub, and he died catering an Airbnb event in San Francisco and had a heart attack while he was holding a tray. It was the American nightmare, so I hear exactly what you're saying. But his daughter became the first woman of color in the state Senate, and for him, the American dream was just that we could solve our problems peacefully, like in a field, which is kind of what we still have in Vermont that I try to hold on to, is we don't personally attack each other in politics. We still do talk about the merits of the issue, and we don't let this rhetoric divide us. And so, and we have town meeting, and I just want to hold on to that and make it more diverse so everyone can have that, because we're like 12 people in a gym voting, and people are waiting in line in Texas past closing hours for the polls with no food and water to vote. And so we just have to share what we have, like the Vermont dream maybe, if not the American dream.
Yeah, and I feel like it's useful kind of in a similar way. Like for my grandfather, who was born in 1905, he was born in the United States, his parents were not. Before he died, he had been a business owner, just kind of a small business owner, but then he retired in Florida, and he felt like this was the greatest country on earth. And he had experienced a degree of social and economic mobility such that he could not have imagined. And there was a kind of fulfillment of the dream for white ethnics who came to the United States in the early part of the 20th century or in the late 19th century. People who were, after World War II, who were understood as white. Jews often were not, especially Eastern European Jews in the early 20th century, but after World War II they were. And he did have an experience of incredible social mobility and moving toward home ownership and business ownership. And so the only reason I don't want to give it up is because I want that to be possible for everybody. I want everyone to be able to say, this is the greatest country on earth. with a straight face, and the way my grandfather said it by the end of his life.
And I might just add to that briefly by saying that we may reconceptualize the American dream to mean that everyone in this country has economic and social rights. That maybe that's the American dream, where of that vision. And if I might make one other point, a lot of what we're talking about here, and whether it's particularly the solutions, they're very American solutions, and they harken back to the best moments in our history, from the Revolution to the Civil War, to the New Deal, to the Great Society, to the Poor People's Campaign, to the Black Lives Matter movement, to Fight for 15. We have enormous challenges and problems here, but we also have lots of solutions that are very much so American solutions, where people in this country have fought for those policies and solutions. And I think if we can, there's this notion from folks on the right that we're trying to turn America into France or Denmark. When we talk about a lot of these policies, we implemented them here 50 years ago. And so it's a matter, I think, of rediscovering many of our roots, and carrying that torch and continuing to try to finish the unfinished business of the civil rights movement and the Poor People's Campaign, among other social movements.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to?
Sure, does anybody else have a question? Yes.
My takeaway, I agree with you about the definition of American dream. And what I'm taking away from the panel, which has been very helpful, is the important step to get to a good life is hearing each other. And what you're contributing is the stories that we all need to begin to understand. And I'm going to use Brad as an example because I've read most of your books. I absolutely love them. And North was the one that really opened my eyes to what the immigrants have to go through coming through from South America. I was stunned. And therefore, I start looking more broadly at everybody is facing some kind of problem on this long list that we have, whether it's incarceration or women's rights or immigrants or indigenous, and the list goes on. So my goal for the American dream would be that we would all learn to hear the other person's story and learn from that and incorporate their needs into policy. Mm-hmm. And that's where we're so far apart with our country right now that we're not listening to each other, at least at the national level and at state level in some cases. But that would be a dream come true, that we would hear each other. And of course, humanity has not done that for as long as it's existed. But we can work towards that. And that's where the books and the writings and the time that you take to talk is so important.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, storytelling is, one of the greatest ways into other people's lives. But again, who's telling the stories, and who's allowed to tell the stories, and who has the platform? I think there has been a shift. I mean, in publishing, we were talking about all the different realms of, people that's let in and the club and people who aren't. And publishing's another example that, Kesha talked about Harriet Tubman and Henry David Thoreau, and you look back at American literature, and James Fenimore Cooper, the first big American novelist, he was he created Cooperstown, his father did, and it was all about land. It was land-based, and so who were let into that land and who were kicked out. And it was the same thing in the publishing world, and what voices got heard. So, but I do think there has been a shift in the last 10 years, in the last 15 years, that an awareness, at least in the arts, I could speak for the arts, in the visual arts and in publishing, that there should be other voices other than, white men writing their fantasies, which is, what I was. I started writing this book, and I was a white man with a fantasy about what a Somali woman would go through I mean, of course, there was like a monk in the book who's a third of the character and an Afghani veteran from Vermont. So wasn't trying to inhabit one consciousness, but as part of a weave of a nation, what she would go through, and I found out that a lot of my perceptions were wrong, and it actually meant that I would have to come involved with the community and listen to people's stories, and that was a big shift in my practice as the guy in the cabin, alone, herding goats, so yeah, everybody has to get out of their cabin, I guess, if you're a writer.
One thing I would add to what you just said about publishing opening up and books being available is and one of the reasons that we plan this weekend for when we do is because of book banning. This is Book Banning Week, the American Library Association, and I think what's happening on the other side is that consumers are trying to get books taken out, even when they do finally get published and come into the public purview. So that's very frightening.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, please.
Just that I think one thing that white folks can do that's really helpful is know their own story and tell it really honestly. The good, the bad, the ugly, where your ancestors come from. The policy philosophies that we've had in this country are to not talk about your own story of whiteness and to just assimilate with whiteness as your identity, as this invisible thread that ties people together. So you shed your Irishness or your Greekness or your Jewishness to assimilate to that identity. And I have to say, when I went to Nova Scotia, it blew my mind because I'm like, this is like white culture. This is really cool. Like everyone's playing the fiddle and doing some knitting and doing something interesting. It's kind of like Vermont, but it was like, what a great cultural experience that I feel like if you go to a lot of places in the US, they borrow something from this group and that group and they just say, this is like whiteness and, American identity. And it's just a little bit sad, and it kind of makes people want a sense of belonging that forces them to appropriate rather than really truly own their own story.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's a good place to stop. They just got applause. Let's get more.
Okay.